Easy, Pip. We're here. Look,
Ashbourne Hall had not heard laughter in 7 years. Not at Christmas, not at weddings, not when Parliament honoured him, not even when his own brother begged him to live again. The Duke of Ashbourne had become something the county whispered about in drawing-rooms and candlelit parlours. Powerful, feared, untouchable. A man so buried in grief that the servants spoke of him as though he were already a ghost. But then a carriage arrived in the snow, and a woman stepped out who had absolutely no business being there. She carried a letter bearing his seal, a letter he never wrote. She had 2 trunks, a cracked hatbox, a small furious dog, and nowhere else on earth to go. The Duke descended the icy steps to send her away. He had the words prepared, he had every intention of using them, and then she fell spectacularly, completely, at his feet in front of everyone, and the Duke of Ashbourne, the man who had not smiled in 7 years, laughed. The entire household froze. Because what happened next, nobody saw coming. Ashbourne Hall had not changed in 7 years. That was the first thing anyone noticed when they approached it. The way time seemed to have stopped at its iron gates. The way the frost clung to its stone towers, as though even the winter respected the house's grief. The fountains in the front courtyard had been frozen for so long that the servants no longer bothered to check whether they still worked beneath the ice. The yew hedges had grown tall and dark, trimmed to perfect severity, like sentinels standing watch over a monument rather than a home. It was January. The sky over Derbyshire was the colour of old pewter, low and still, pressing down over the estate like a closed lid. The oaks that lined the long approach road stood bare, their branches black against the white fields, and the carriage track that wound through them had not been used by any arriving guest in longer than most of the younger servants could remember. Inside the hall the air was cool and quiet, not the quiet of peace. The quiet of something held still by force. Black mourning crape still hung in the upper gallery, tucked into the corners where 3 different housemaids had tried to remove it, and been told, each time, to leave it where it was. The ballroom doors were sealed. The music room had a velvet cloth draped over the pianoforte, and the curtains had been drawn across the windows so long that the fabric had faded on the outer folds while remaining dark on the inner. In the east corridor, a suit of armour stood in its alcove without so much as a cobweb on its shoulder, because Mrs. Matilda Warren kept Ashbourne Hall immaculate. But she could not keep it alive. The nursery on the 3rd floor had not been opened since the night of January the 14th, 7 years before. The door was still locked. The key had not moved from its hook. Benedict Stirling, Duke of Ashbourne, had put it there himself and had not touched it since. He was 35 years old. He was considered, by those who spoke of such things in drawing-rooms and private correspondence, to be one of the most powerful men in England. He held 2 parliamentary seats through his estate interests, managed 12,000 acres of Derbyshire farmland, and oversaw the welfare of nearly 300 tenant families who had served under the Stirling name for 4 generations. His word in the House of Lords carried the particular weight that came from a man who was respected not because he was liked, but because he was always right. He was not a cruel man. He had never been a cruel man. His tenants knew it. His servants knew it. His younger brother, Lord Sebastian Stirling, knew it better than anyone alive, because Sebastian remembered the Benedict who had existed before grief had carved him into something colder and quieter and harder to reach. But the man who sat now in the estate study, surrounded by ledger books and parliamentary correspondence and the thin grey light that crept through the tall windows, was not easy to love. He was easy to fear and somewhat easier to respect, and nearly impossible to reach. Benedict moved his pen across the page without looking up. His desk was ordered with precision, reports stacked by date, correspondence sorted by urgency, a single inkwell that Harlan Goodwin, the butler, replaced every Monday morning whether it needed replacing or not. His morning coat was perfectly fitted, his cravat was tied without a wrinkle, his dark hair was combed without vanity, and his face, which had once been described by more than one society column as arresting in its severity, betrayed nothing at all. He finished reading a tenant's petition regarding drainage on the North Fields and set it aside in the correct stack. He did not look out the window. He had no particular reason to look out the window. There was nothing arriving. There was never anything arriving. He reached for the next letter. From downstairs, he heard the sound of a door opening and Mrs. Warren's voice, low, clipped, surprised. And then a sound he had not heard in this house in many years, a dog barking. Small, sharp, indignant. Benedict's pen stopped moving. He did not put it down immediately. He sat with it held above the page for the space of several seconds, listening, waiting for the sound to resolve itself into an explanation that required nothing of him. It did not. He set the pen down. Sebastian Sterling had spent the previous evening at his club in London, drinking rather more port than was advisable, and trying not to think about what was happening at Ashbourne Hall. He had been trying not to think about it for 3 weeks, ever since the letters had been sent, the arrangements confirmed, and the carriage hired. He was 29 years old, dark-haired like his brother, but built lighter and quicker, with a face that laughed more easily and eyes that watched everything. People sometimes forgot, when Sebastian was smiling, that he was also thinking. He had inherited their father's charm and their mother's intelligence, and he had spent the last 7 years watching his elder brother inherit their grandfather's grief. He had tried everything. He had tried inviting Benedict to London. Declined. He had tried bringing guests to Ashbourne, permitted, once, then quietly not invited again. He had tried speaking directly about Evangeline, met with the kind of controlled silence that was worse than anger. He had tried speaking about the future, met with the kind of polite rebuff that made a man feel he had suggested something indecent. 7 years. 7 years of watching Benedict move through his own life as though he were a visitor in it, as though the world were a place he was maintaining rather than inhabiting, as though every day were simply an obligation to get through until the obligation ended. It was Sebastian who had found Mrs. Helena Whittaker, a discreet London marriage broker who handled private arrangements for families who preferred not to advertise their need for one. It was Sebastian who had explained the situation, carefully, selectively, and arranged for a prospective bride to travel to Ashbourne Hall under the pretense of a formal introduction, using Benedict's name and the Ashbourne seal, which he had taken from Benedict's correspondence drawer 3 months before, and not yet returned. He knew it was wrong. He had known it was wrong when he did it. He had been unable to stop himself from doing it anyway, because the alternative, watching Benedict disappear into himself for another 7 years, had seemed worse than any anger his brother might direct at him afterward. The woman Mrs. Whittaker had found was called Cecilia Pembroke. 25, respectable family, though she had no living parents and no fortune. She had worked as a companion and music tutor. She was currently, according to Mrs. Whittaker's inquiries, in a position of some difficulty, which Sebastian had taken to mean she needed this as much as Benedict needed her. He had told himself that made it all right. He was beginning to suspect it did not make it all right at all. The carriage had not been comfortable. Cecilia Pembroke had known this when she hired it, the least expensive of the 3 available options in the village of Harwich, which was the last town of any size before the Derbyshire roads turned to frozen ruts and frozen silence. She had wrapped herself in her travelling cloak, tucked Pip under her arm, and tried to review the arrangement in her head for the 12th time during the 3-hour journey, looking for the detail that would tell her she had made a mistake. She had not found one, The letter bore the Ashbourne seal. The broker, Mrs. Whittaker, was reputable. The terms were clear: a practical arrangement between a widowed duke, who required a second duchess, and a gentlewoman of good character, who required a secure position. No one had pretended it was a love match. Cecilia had specifically not pretended it was a love match. She had £25 remaining in her purse, one cracked hat box, 2 trunks, a bundle of music sheets she had refused to leave behind, and Pip, who was 12 pounds of cream-coloured terrier and had been barking at the frost-covered window for the last 20 minutes. She was not romantic about this. She was not going to be romantic about this. But when the carriage finally turned through the iron gates, and the full length of Ashbourne Hall came into view, its towers rising grey and grand against the winter sky, its windows catching what little light remained in the January afternoon, something in Cecilia's chest tightened and would not loosen. It was not fear, exactly. It was the recognition of a place that had once been magnificent and had since become something else. She straightened her spine and shifted Pip to her other arm and reminded herself that she was not here to feel things. She was here to secure a future. Those were entirely different projects. The carriage drew up to the front steps. A footman opened the door. Cecilia stepped down carefully, holding Pip against her chest, and stood on the sweep of gravelled drive before Ashbourne Hall. The air was sharp and still. Somewhere above the roofline, a rook called once and went silent. The front doors were already open. Mrs. Warren stood in the doorway, her expression a careful arrangement of professional courtesy that was barely concealing considerable surprise. 3 footmen had appeared along the front steps. A young maid had come to the edge of the entrance hall and stopped there, staring, and then there was movement in the upper doorway past Mrs. Warren, and the figure that appeared at the top of the marble steps drove every other thought straight out of Cecilia's head. He was tall. He was dark. He was dressed in mourning black from his coat to his boots, and he moved down the steps with the deliberate ease of a man who had never once considered that the world might not arrange itself to accommodate him. His face was. She had not expected that face. She had expected old or cold or both. He was neither old nor cold, precisely. He was 35, and the lines at the corners of his eyes and the set of his jaw told her he had lived those 35 years with intensity. He was the most controlled-looking human being she had ever seen in her life, and the word that came to her, uninvited and inconvenient, was grieving, not cold. Grieving. There was a difference. Benedict descended the final step and stopped. His gaze moved from the carriage to the 2 trunks, to the cracked hat box to Pip, who chose that precise moment to bark with considerable authority, and then to Cecilia herself. He looked at her for a moment that stretched considerably longer than politeness required. Then he looked at the letter Mrs. Warren was extending toward him. He took it. He read it. The controlled expression on his face did not change, but something in his eyes shifted, something flat and cold and dangerous. Miss Pembroke. His voice was exactly what she had expected, low, even, precise. "Your Grace," Cecilia said, and she began her curtsy. Later she would blame the ice. There was a film of it across the marble step, transparent, invisible, waiting with the particular patience of a trap that has been there all along. Her boot found it at the exact moment. Her weight shifted forward into the curtsy. Her heel went sideways. Her arms flew out. The hat box, which she had tucked under her arm, struck the footman beside her and sent his tray of calling cards into the air like startled birds. Her reticule, the clasp of which had been unreliable since Harwick, burst open and scattered its contents across the snow-dusted stone. Pip launched himself free and hit the ground running. Her bonnet tipped forward over one eye completely, and then she went down, not gracefully, not quickly, but in a long, terrible, slow slide across the icy marble that gave everyone present ample time to watch it happen. She landed at the Duke's boots, pale blue skirts and dignity gone together. Pip, liberated, barked once in her general direction, as though to note that this was, in his estimation, a national emergency. The footman who had lost his tray stood frozen. The young maid in the doorway had both hands over her mouth, Mrs. Warren's professional expression had been entirely overtaken by something that was either horror or suppressed laughter, and Harlan Goodwin, who had been butler at Ashbourne Hall for 22 years and had seen everything, had gone the colour of chalk. Sebastian, standing to the left of the doorway where he had been watching the arrival, with the expression of a man who has set a fire and is now wondering whether he can blame the candle, pressed both hands hard over his mouth. And Benedict Stirling, Duke of Ashbourne, who had not smiled in 7 years, who had not smiled at Christmas, not at weddings, not when his tenants praised him, not when Parliament honoured him, not when Sebastian had tried every joke and every trick and every gentle provocation available to a loving younger brother. Laughed. Not a polite laugh, not a controlled, aristocratic acknowledgement of comedy, not the brief exhale that passed for amusement in drawing-rooms. A real laugh, full and unguarded and completely helpless, that came from somewhere deep and startled and had not been let out. In so long, it didn't quite know how to stop. The entire household froze, because none of them, not Harlan, not Mrs. Warren, not the young maid, not any of the footmen, had heard that sound in 7 years. Benedict stopped himself. He pressed his lips together. He composed himself with visible effort, the way a man reassembles a mask he has dropped in public, and reached down to offer his gloved hand to the woman at his feet. Cecilia took it. She stood. She adjusted her bonnet with one hand and retrieved her dignity with the other, which was considerably harder to find, and she looked up at him. His face was composed again, but she had seen it. She had seen the crack, the split second of unguarded life, and something did a complicated thing that she refused to name. "Miss Pembroke," he said, controlled once more, "whatever brought you here was not written by my hand." Cecilia felt the hope she had carried through 3 hours of frozen Derbyshire roads begin to crumble. She lifted her chin. "I see. You will be returned to London by morning. The carriage will be—" "I cannot return to London, Your Grace," she said quietly. He paused. "There is no London left for me." The silence that followed was of a completely different quality from the one that had existed before she arrived. Benedict looked at her, really looked, the way a man studies something he has not decided what to do with. And for one moment, the Duke of Ashbourne was not composed at all. Then the mask returned, smooth and complete. "Come inside," he said. The drawing-room at Ashbourne Hall was large and cold and almost beautiful. Almost, because beauty requires some warmth to complete itself. And the drawing-room had not been properly warmed in years. The fire in the grate was small and dutiful rather than generous. The curtains had been drawn back, but the light that came through the tall windows was thin and grey, and did little to soften the room's severity. The furniture was fine. Deep green brocade chairs, a rosewood writing table, a Turkish rug worn soft with age, but it had the particular air of a room that was maintained without being used. Cecilia sat in one of the green chairs with a blanket Mrs. Warren had produced, without being asked, because Mrs. Warren was the sort of woman who solved what she could solve, while reserving judgment on everything else. Pip had been removed, protesting, to the kitchen by a nervous young footman named Edwin, who had been told by Harlan that the creature was a guest and was to be treated accordingly. Benedict stood by the fire. He had not sat down. He was watching her with the steady and unreadable attention of a man who was good at reading things and did not intend to show it. "Tell me how this arrangement came about," he said. Cecilia told him. She was precise about it, and she was honest, because she had determined on a carriage ride from Harwick that if she was going to be here at all, she was going to be here honestly. She told him about Mrs. Whittaker, about the letter, about the Ashbourne seal. She watched his face as she described the communication and saw the moment he understood who was responsible. A muscle moved in his jaw. "And your previous situation," he said. "You mentioned you could not return to London." She looked at her hands for a moment. Then she looked up. "I was employed as companion and music tutor in the household of Lord Dorian Vaughan," she said, "for 14 months. Last spring, Lord Vaughan made advances of a dishonourable nature. I refused him. He dismissed me without a character reference, and communicated his version of events to several families with whom I might otherwise have secured new employment." She said it plainly the way you say a thing that hurt you enormously and which you have since decided to carry as fact, rather than wound. "No reputable household in London will employ me without a reference," she continued. "I have no family remaining. I have £25 and a dog. The arrangement described in your letter, the letter I believed was yours, offered safety and dignity. I did not come for wealth or romance, Your Grace. I came because it was the last door that appeared to be open." Benedict was silent for a long moment. Inside him, something moved that he had not expected. Not pity. He was honest enough with himself to know the difference between pity and the anger that rose in him when he considered a powerful man quietly destroying a woman's life because she had refused to be commanded. The anger was real. He did not show it. "You are not my bride," he said. "You are not my betrothed. This arrangement was entered into through a deception I intend to address directly. You are a guest who has been brought here under false pretenses, and for that I owe you an apology." Cecilia looked at him steadily. "That is unexpectedly gracious of you, Your Grace. You may remain temporarily while I make arrangements, but I want no confusion about what that means. There will be no marriage, no attachment, no future of that particular kind between us. I understand." Her voice was very quiet. "I have been unwanted before. I recognize the shape of it." The line landed like something thrown carefully at a very specific target. Benedict looked away from her, toward the fire, and said nothing for several seconds. He was thinking about the shape of it. The particular shape of being told your presence is tolerated but not desired. Your existence inconvenient but not yet solved. He knew that shape, in a different way, from the inside. He had worn it like a second morning coat for 7 years. "I will speak to Sebastian," he said. He found Sebastian in the library. Sebastian had positioned himself beside the window with a glass of brandy, and expression of a man who has been waiting for an execution, and has decided to meet it with reasonable composure. He had been listening to the sounds of the household. Cecilia's voice in the drawing-room, Mrs. Warren's footsteps on the stairs, Pip's distant protests from the kitchen, and trying to decide whether any of this had been a mistake. It had been a mistake in method. He was less certain it had been a mistake in intention. Benedict came through the library door and closed it. The silence between them was not comfortable. "You used my seal," Benedict said. "Yes." "You forged my name to a marriage broker's correspondence." "Yes." "You arranged for a woman to travel 3 hours through a January snowstorm to a house she believed had sent for her." "Yes." Sebastian set down his glass. "I did all of those things, Benedict, and I knew they were wrong when I did them. I still did them. Then you need to explain yourself." Sebastian looked at his brother, really looked at him the way he looked when he was not performing ease but actually paying attention, and he said, "You have been dying for 7 years. Not quickly, not dramatically, just steadily. A little less of you, each winter, a little more of the estate, a little more of the ledgers, a little less of everything that is not obligation. I watched you stop laughing, stop dancing, stop caring whether the fire in your study was lit. I watched you put Evangeline's portrait under a veil and then disappear behind one of your own." Benedict's expression had not changed, but his stillness had become a different kind of stillness. "I did it," Sebastian said, "because I am afraid of losing you, and every method that was proper and polite and appropriate has failed entirely. You call this loyalty. I call it burial. Evangeline died once, Benedict. Must you die every day after her?" The words hit the room like stones dropped into still water. Benedict turned toward the bookshelves and stayed there with his back to his brother. For a long moment, his hand resting on the spine of a volume he was not seeing. "You will not interfere again," he said. His voice was controlled to the point of fragility. "Do you understand me?" "Yes. She stays until I have made proper arrangements for her return. That is all." Sebastian said nothing, but he remembered the laugh. He had heard it from the doorway, that unguarded, helpless, real laugh that had come out of Benedict like something long imprisoned breaking free. And he thought, perhaps it is enough. Perhaps one crack is enough if it is the right crack. He said nothing about this. Some things were better left unspoken while they found their own way. Cecilia, meanwhile, had found that being temporarily allowed to remain in a house was not very different from being temporarily allowed to exist in it, which was not entirely comfortable, but which she had sufficient experience with to manage. She asked Mrs. Warren, in the most matter-of-fact tone she could arrange, whether there was anything useful she might do to earn her keep while she was here. Mrs. Warren, who was a woman of practical rather than sentimental nature, studied her for a moment and then assigned her 3 tasks: arranging the flowers in the entrance hall, sorting the music sheets in the morning room, and assisting with the household correspondence that had accumulated during Mrs. Warren's recent illness. Cecilia managed the music sheets with perfect competence. She managed the correspondence nearly perfectly, except for one inkwell, which she knocked sideways while reaching across the desk, and which deposited its contents across the left margin of a letter to the Derbyshire Agricultural Society. She blotted it immediately. The letter was salvageable. She set it aside and did not mention it to anyone. The flowers were a more complex endeavor. She was arranging the arrangement in the entrance hall. White roses, still beautiful despite the cold, delivered fresh each week because Mrs. Warren believed standards were standards when she stepped back to assess her work and stepped directly into the suit of armor that stood in the alcove to the left of the hall table. It rang out like a bell. She spun around, caught herself, looked at the armor, and said, in a perfectly calm voice, "My apologies." Harlan Goodwin, who had appeared from the corridor at the sound of impact, maintained an expression of absolute serenity. "The armor, I assure you, has sustained worse, Miss Pembroke. I hope you are not required to report this." "The household accident ledger," Harlan said, with the gravity of a man announcing a treaty, "has not been opened in 7 years. I shall endeavor to keep it closed." The servants, who had watched all of this from whatever angles of the hall were available to them, were not laughing. They were not quite not laughing either. A warmth had entered the entrance hall that was not entirely attributable to the fire that Mrs. Warren had ordered lit on a Wednesday which had not happened in years. Benedict watched. He told himself he was monitoring a situation, that he was tracking the presence of a woman he had not invited and was responsible for until she could be safely returned to wherever she was going to go, that his awareness of her movements through the house was practical rather than personal. He watched her thank Edwin for bringing Pip back from the kitchen, and he watched her press Pip's ridiculous little face between her hands and speak to him in a low, earnest voice, as though the dog understood and cared about everything she said, which the dog, he noted, appeared to. He watched her sit in the morning room with the music sheets spread across the floor, sorting them with a quiet absorption that suggested she knew exactly what she was doing. Her hands moved over the pages with a familiarity that told him she had played these pieces. He watched her apologize to the suit of armor. He turned away from the corridor window and went back to his desk and wrote 2 letters and answered 3 and reviewed a drainage report and was almost completely successful in not thinking about Cecilia Pembroke for the rest of the afternoon. That evening, after supper, he went upstairs. He went to the 3rd-floor corridor without quite deciding to go there. His feet knew the way without him having to direct them. They had always known the way. They had taken him there 100 times in the years since Evangeline, in the private hours of the night when the house was quiet and the weight of everything became briefly unbearable. He stood outside the nursery door. The key was on its hook, 6 inches from his left hand. He did not reach for it. He had not reached for it in 7 years. He did not reach for it now. He simply stood, in the way he had learned to simply stand, in the way that was not quite the same as enduring, and not quite the same as healing, and was perhaps something that existed without a proper name. He heard a soft sound from the corridor behind him. He turned. Cecilia Pembroke was standing 10 feet away, holding a small candle, clearly having lost her way. There were approximately 30 rooms on the upper floors of Ashbourne Hall, and the east and west wings were not obviously differentiated in the dark. She saw him and stopped immediately, saw the door he was standing beside, saw the locked keyhole, saw his face. She did not ask. She simply moved to the side of the corridor, away from the nursery, and sat down on the floor with her back against the wall and her candle placed beside her. And she stayed there. Benedict looked at her. She did not look at him. She looked at the candle flame, which was a polite direction to look when a man was standing outside a locked door at 11 o'clock at night, not crying but not crying either. He did not tell her to go to bed. He stood outside the nursery a little longer, and then he sat, with considerable reluctance, on the floor across from her, his back against the opposite wall, and the corridor was quiet between them in a way that was different from the quiet of the rest of the house, less like a chapel, more like the last room before dawn. After a long time he said, "This house was not always like this." Cecilia kept her eyes on the candle. "No house is born silent, Your Grace." He did not answer, but something in him eased, almost imperceptibly, in the way a knot loosens when it is not pulled at. Days passed at Ashbourne Hall in the particular way that days pass when something has changed, but no one has yet decided to acknowledge it. The fires were lit more often. This was Mrs. Warren's doing officially. She told Harlan that the cold had been getting into the East Wing guest rooms and that it was simply a matter of proper household management. Harlan said nothing to contradict this. The servants said nothing to contradict it either. They all understood, in the way that servants understand everything, that the fires being lit had rather more to do with the pale young woman in the blue travelling gown than with the East Wing guest rooms. Cecilia had asked on her 3rd morning whether the curtains in the morning room might be opened. Even grief, she had said to Mrs. Warren, with a matter-of-fact lightness that was either very brave or very unaware of itself, should not be allowed to mildew the draperies. Mrs. Warren had looked at her for a long moment, and then she had opened the curtains. The morning room had filled with winter light, white and cold and sharp, but real light, the kind that woke things up rather than preserved them. Mrs. Warren had stood in it for a moment and said nothing, and then she had gone back to her duties with a very particular expression that was not quite softness and not quite grief, but was somewhere between the two. The morning room curtains stayed open. By the end of the first week, several other curtains had opened as well, not because anyone ordered it, but because the habit of darkness loses its grip when light is near enough to make the contrast visible. Benedict found her in the library on a Tuesday. She had climbed onto a reading stool to reach a volume on the upper shelves, a collection of Scarlatti sonatas, which had no business being on the upper shelf, but had evidently been placed there by someone who preferred to make music inaccessible, and she was reaching on her toes, her fingers just short of the spine, when the stool rocked. He crossed the room in 3 strides. His hands caught her at the waist an instant before the stool went sideways. She came back against him with a soft impact, her back against his chest, his arms around her for exactly the fraction of a second. It took to steady her on solid ground. He was aware of the warmth of her through the layers of her dress and his coat, and the faint scent of rosewater in her hair, and the way her breath had caught. Not with fear, but with something else, something startled and aware. He released her immediately. The space between them returned. He stepped back. She turned to face him, and her cheeks were flushed with something that was not cold. "Must you make war upon every elevated surface in this house?" he said. She was gathering her composure visibly, assembling it piece by piece with the diligent speed of a woman who had significant practice. "Only the ones that challenge me first, Your Grace." He almost said something. He chose not to. He retrieved the Scarlatti volume from the shelf himself, handed it to her, and left the library without looking back, because looking back would have meant acknowledging something he was not ready to name. In the corridor he stopped. He stood in the corridor for a moment, with his hand pressed flat against the wall, and his heart was doing something irregular that had not happened in a very long time, and which he found extremely inconvenient. It was after a dinner that went quietly wrong. Benedict had not intended for dinner to go wrong. It went wrong in the way things go wrong when a man has been alone in his severity for so long that he has forgotten that other people feel the weight of it. He made an observation, cool and accurate, about the inadvisability of a woman in Cecilia's position expecting any particular future from a temporary shelter, and he said it in his precise, controlled voice, and it landed on the table between them like something that could not be taken back. Cecilia set down her fork. She did not argue, she did not become tearful. She simply became very quiet, in the way a person becomes quiet when they are deciding to be dignified rather than honest, and she excused herself from the table, and she went upstairs. Benedict remained at the table. He finished his wine. He reviewed the drainage report he had brought to the dinner table, which was a habit he had maintained for several years, and which he was beginning to distantly recognize as the behavior of a man who has forgotten what dinner is for. He went to the library. He worked until the fire burned low and then lower, and did not ring for more coal, and worked in the cold by the light of 2 diminishing candles until sometime past 2 in the morning, when he reached for a blank sheet of paper and found instead something that had been placed on his desk, a folded blanket, wool, cream, warm, the kind that had been taken from the linen cupboard, Warren's best, he noted, not the servant's, and folded with care and placed precisely where his hand would find it. Beneath it, a single folded note. "Grief is not weakness, Your Grace, but neither is warmth. No signature, none, was needed." Benedict held the note for a long time. The candles burned down. The cold in the library was considerable. He wrapped the blanket around his shoulders without quite deciding to, and he sat in the dark library of Ashbourne Hall on a January night 7 years after everything had broken, and he let himself feel it, not the controlled, managed version of it that he carried as discipline, but the real weight of it. Evangeline's face, and the silence that had come after, and the 7 winters of mornings he had woken to a world that had lost its warmth and not known what to do with the cold. He wept without sound, in the manner of men who have learned that grief is something to be survived rather than witnessed. And when it was done, he folded the blanket with care and placed the note in the inner pocket of his coat and sat for a while longer in the quiet dark. He did not feel better. Exactly. But he felt less alone, which was a different thing, and in some ways more frightening. He heard the music before he reached the door. He had come downstairs from the upper corridor, where he had gone to stand outside the nursery. His nightly, almost ceremonial visit to the door he could not open, and he was passing through the toward his study when the sound reached him, the pianoforte, soft, tentative, as if the person playing was not sure they had permission, or was not sure the instrument still remembered how to sing. The notes were careful, feeling their way through a melody he recognized from some distance of memory. A Scarlatti piece, bright and slightly melancholy, exactly the kind of thing Evangeline had played on winter evenings before everything changed. Benedict stopped walking. The music continued. It grew slightly more confident. Not bold, but present. The way a quiet voice grows less quiet when it realizes it is not being stopped. The notes threaded through the corridor and through the gallery and through the locked rooms and the covered furniture and the 7 years of careful, arranged silence. And they were just notes, just music, just the ordinary miracle of sound in a house that had forbidden it. He walked to the music room door. He opened it. Cecilia stopped playing instantly. She was half-turned on the bench before the covered portion of the pianoforte. She had lifted only the front portion of the velvet cloth, as if she had been trying to use as little as possible of the room. Her hands were in her lap. Her face was the face of someone who had been caught doing something they knew was wrong and had been unable to stop themselves from doing it anyway. "I apologize," she said. "I heard it mentioned that the room was, I should not have." He said nothing. He stood in the doorway. The candles on the wall bracket threw warm, unsteady light across the room, across the partially unveiled pianoforte, across her face. After a silence that stretched longer than was entirely comfortable, he said, "Continue." She looked at him, really looked at him, as if checking whether he meant it. He moved to the chair near the window and sat, with his back very straight and his face turned slightly away from her, and he said nothing else. Cecilia turned back to the keys. She played. She played for 20 minutes, and he sat in the chair by the window for all of it. She could feel his attention, not uncomfortably, but acutely, the way you feel the heat of a fire when you are not looking at it. She played the Scarlatti through, and then a softer piece she had composed herself during the long, quiet months after Lord Dorian Vaughan's household, when she had been sitting in a rented room in Holborn with very little money and quite a lot of time to put her sadness into something that could not be taken away. She was not playing it for him exactly. She was playing it because the room wanted it, because the keys were cold under her fingers and warming slowly, because something about being in this particular room at this particular hour felt like permission she had not been given anywhere in a long time. She stopped. The room held the last note for a moment. Benedict's voice came from the chair, quieter than before. "You play as though you are apologizing for being heard." Cecilia looked at her hands. "I have learned that some rooms punish women for making sound." She felt rather than saw him shift, as if the words had touched something that was not intended to be touchable. He stood. He crossed the room, not toward the door, toward her, which was not something she had anticipated, and he stood beside the pianoforte. He looked at the keys for a moment, and then he reached out and touched the ivory of the lowest note, not pressing it, just resting his finger against it. His hand was close to hers. The closeness was a physical fact, like the cold in the room or the candlelight. He was near enough that she could see the slight irregularity in his breathing, the way it had changed, the way it was now doing something different from what it had been doing when he sat in the chair. She looked up at him. His face was not composed, not entirely. There was something in it that was fighting itself, the way two currents in a river fight when they meet, something wanting and something afraid, and something that had been still for so long it did not know how to move without hurting. His hand brushed hers over the keys, a brief contact, accidental in its precision. The melody she had been playing died entirely. He was close enough that she could see the grain of his cravat, the line of his jaw, the slight tension in the muscle of his neck. His eyes, which she had been cataloguing as dark and unreadable, were neither of those things at close range. They were grey and complicated, and looking at her with an attention so complete it was nearly overwhelming. "This should not happen," he said. His voice was barely above quiet. Cecilia felt the warmth of the moment, the impossible closeness of it, and then felt him pull back. Not physically, not yet, but in some interior way, some decision made behind the eyes, and she understood it before he stepped away. She understood it, and it hurt, and she was not going to let him see that it hurt. "No, Your Grace," she said, and her voice was steady. "I imagine very little that happens to me should." He stepped back. The air between them returned to its proper, respectable temperature. He left the music room without saying anything else. Cecilia sat at the pianoforte for a long time after that, not playing, letting the warmth of those few minutes settle into her memory where it would have to stay. Benedict spent the night restless in a way he had not been restless in years. He lay in the dark of his room and he thought about Evangeline, tried to think about Evangeline as a corrective, as a reminder of everything that mattered. He thought about the evening they had first played together in that room years ago, before everything. He thought about her hands on the keys and her laugh, and the way she had turned to look at him over her shoulder when she finished a piece, waiting for his response. He thought about all of it, and it was real, and it hurt in the familiar way, the way that had become almost comfortable in its familiarity. And then, beneath all of it, there was Cecilia's face in the candlelight, Cecilia's hand under his, Cecilia's voice saying some rooms punish women for making sound, with that quiet, factual bravery that made him want to undo every room that had ever punished her. He was not going to think about that. He pressed the back of his hand against his closed eyes and breathed slowly, and told himself very firmly that he was not going to think about that. He thought about it until morning. Lady Vivienne Carrington arrived on a Thursday. She arrived in the correct manner. Calling card sent the day before. Morning visit at the appropriate hour. Perfectly timed to coincide with the period when Ashbourne Hall was at its most formal and Benedict was at his most available for social obligation. She was 42, and she was beautiful in the way that very elegant women are beautiful. Everything arranged to exact effect, nothing accidental, nothing unguarded. She had expected to become the next Duchess of Ashbourne. Not imminently, not without courtship. She was not vulgar about it, but she had identified Benedict Sterling 3 years ago as the logical end of her widowhood, and she had been patient, and she had been available, and she had positioned herself carefully, and she had understood that a man of his grief required time. She had given him time. She had not been informed that a woman called Cecilia Pembroke would arrive in a hired carriage with a cracked hatbox and a barking terrier, and apparently take up residence in Benedict's house, while the household began to light fires in rooms that had been cold for 7 years. This information had reached her through 3 separate letters within a week of Cecilia's arrival. She was, to say the least, interested. She sat in the drawing-room and accepted tea, and spoke to Benedict about the upcoming winter relief ball, the charity event that the estate traditionally hosted for tenant support, and which had not been held since Evangeline's death. There was some question of reviving it, given the brutal winter and the genuine need of several tenant families on the North Fields. Vivienne had positioned herself as the natural person to organize it. She raised the question of the ball with elegant purpose, and watched Benedict's face while he answered. She was watching it when Cecilia came through the drawing-room door with Pip under one arm and a stack of correspondence under the other, clearly having taken a wrong turn from the morning room. The house was architecturally complex, and Cecilia had been navigating it for only 12 days. Cecilia stopped in the doorway when she saw Lady Vivian. Vivian smiled. "Oh, you must be the guest." How charming, that one word, that particular pause before it. Anyone who had spent time in society would have heard exactly what it was doing. Cecilia heard it. She tilted her chin slightly. "Lady Carrington, I apologize for the interruption." She addressed the next part to Benedict. "I will leave these on the hall table, Your Grace." And she began to back out of the room with as much dignity as possible, while holding a dog that had decided, at this precise moment, to growl at Lady Vivian with the concentrated intensity of a much larger animal. "No," Benedict said. One word, not loud. Cecilia stopped. Lady Carrington was leaving, he said. "Please stay." Vivian looked at him. A long, measured look. She rose from her chair with perfect grace and said she looked forward to discussing the ball further in due course, and she left, beautifully, correctly, with every appearance of ease. But her eyes, as she passed Cecilia in the doorway, were not beautiful at all. Sebastian, who had stayed on at Ashbourne Hall, under the thin pretense of needing to discuss estate matters with his brother, found Cecilia in the library that afternoon. He sat down across from her without ceremony. He was not always graceful about difficult things, but he was usually honest about them, which was perhaps the more valuable quality. "Lady Vivian," he said, without preamble, "is very good at harming people without raising her voice." "I know," Cecilia said. She was sorting correspondence without looking up. "I have met that particular skill before. I am sorry that you are here in a position to be harmed by it." Cecilia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You did not ruin me, Lord Sebastian. You merely delivered me to a house where everyone can see it." Sebastian absorbed this. He had the good grace to wince. "That was precise and unkind and entirely fair," he said. Cecilia looked up. She studied him for a moment, this younger sterling brother, who wore his guilt openly and his love for Benedict on every surface of his face, and she said, more gently, "You did it because you love him. I understand that. Good intentions, however, are not an armor, not for the person you place in their path." Sebastian nodded. "What can I do?" "Stop apologizing to me," she said, "and start being honest with him. That is where the real work is." That evening a storm came down from the north, and the lamps in the west corridor went out. Cecilia had been making her way back from Mrs. Warren's sitting room, where she had spent an hour helping sort through a box of linen inventories that someone had let fall into considerable disorder, and she was carrying a single candle that the draught from the storm had been threatening for the last 3 turns of the corridor. The lamp on the wall sconce was dead. She paused to let her eyes adjust to the dimmer light, stepped forward, and walked directly into Benedict. He caught her by the arms. She steadied against him, her free hand landing on his coat, and they stood in the dark of the west corridor, with the storm pressing at the windows and the candle flame guttering between them, and neither of them moved. His hands on her arms were warm through the wool of her sleeves. She could hear the weather outside, wild and without apology. She could hear him breathing. "You have made disorder of my house, Cecilia," he said. His voice was very low. His use of her name, without the title, without the distance, was not accidental. She felt it in the hollow of her chest. "I am sorry, Your Grace," she said. "I did not say I wished you to stop." The candle was the only light in the corridor, and it was small, and the storm was making the whole sandhouse feel very close and very private, and his face, which she could barely see, was turned toward hers with an expression she felt, rather than observed. The moment lasted, and then, from the far end of the corridor, a lamp appeared. Edwin, carrying a spare light, navigating by memory, doing his job with the conscientious dedication of a young footman who had no idea what he was interrupting. They separated. 3 feet, 4 feet. The corridor became a corridor again.
"I will have Harlan see to the lamps,"
Benedict said, and his voice was level. "Thank you," Cecilia said. She went to her room and sat on the edge of her bed with her hands in her lap, and her heart was doing something complicated, and she thought about the rules she had made for herself. No vulnerability to powerful men, no dependence, no hope that could be used against her. And she thought about how much easier those rules were to keep when you had never stood in a dark corridor with a grieving duke who had just said your name. 3 days after the corridor, a letter arrived bearing Lord Dorian Vaughan's seal. Cecilia read it in her room alone, and then she sat with it in her lap and breathed carefully until the cold feeling in her chest receded enough to be manageable. Dorian's handwriting was elegant and composed, which was very like him. The letter was politely worded, which was also very like him. It said he had learned she was at Ashbourne Hall, and that he intended to call, as he was concerned for her welfare and wished to offer what assistance he could. Assistance. The word sat on the page with its pleasant face and its poisoned interior, and Cecilia knew exactly what it meant. He had heard she was here. He had decided this was a problem. He was coming to manage it. She went downstairs. Benedict was in his study. She knocked. He told her to enter. She came in, stood before his desk, and placed the letter on top of his papers without preface. He read it. His face did not change, in the way his face never changed when something made him genuinely angry. The control became tighter, not looser, which was, she was learning, a significant distinction. "Tell me the rest of it," he said. She told him the rest of it, a full account. The months in Dorian's household, the escalating pressure, the morning she had refused him flatly and completely, and the afternoon she had been dismissed. The letters Dorian had sent to 3 families who had expressed interest in her services. The specific things he had said, or implied, that had ensured she would not find reputable employment in London again. Benedict listened without interrupting. His pen was in his hand, but he was not writing. When she finished, he said, "He touched your name because he could not command your will." The precision of it, the way he had understood the mechanism of it, the particular cruelty of it, made Cecilia's throat tighten. "He will not come to Ashbourne Hall," Benedict said. "You cannot prevent it. He will call socially, and you will be required by courtesy." "He will not come to Ashbourne Hall," Benedict repeated, with a quiet finality that was not a threat but was considerably less comfortable than a threat. Cecilia looked at him steadily. "Powerful men have told me before that I would be protected. It is a generous promise. It does not always survive contact with other powerful men." Benedict set his pen down. He met her eyes. "I do not want your gratitude, Miss Pembroke," he said. "I want you to be honest with me when you are frightened. That is all I am asking." Cecilia looked at him, this controlled, grieving, complicated man, and she said, against her own better judgment, "Then what do you want?" He didn't answer immediately. He looked at her, and the thing that moved through his eyes was too complicated to name in the moment it happened. And then he said, "I find I am not entirely certain. That is an unusual state of affairs for me." She left the study, thinking that honesty was considerably more dangerous than lies. Lord Dorian Vaughan arrived on Friday afternoon. He was everything she had remembered, and nothing she had missed. Tall, fair, and beautifully put together, with the easy manners of a man who had never been told no twice. He greeted Benedict with the correct degree of respectful formality. He greeted Cecilia with the particular familiarity of a man who was asserting ownership of a history. "Miss Pembroke," he said, and his eyes moved over her in the way that had always made her feel like a ledger entry being audited. "How remarkably well you look. Country air becomes you." "Thank you, Lord Vaughan," she said. Tea was brought. The conversation in the drawing-room was beautifully managed. Dorian was a master of the oblique, the implication dressed in concern, the social wound delivered with an expression of charitable worry. He spoke of Cecilia's unfortunate situation when she left his household with such apparent sympathy that anyone who had not known him might have been taken in. Benedict knew him within 6 minutes. He said nothing until Dorian, reaching for his second cup of tea, allowed his elbow to catch Cecilia's cup and send it tipping toward the edge of the table. She caught it, mostly, but the contents splashed across the table and onto Dorian's trouser leg, and he made the noise men make when they are trying not to show they are irritated with the person they have decided to blame for an accident. He looked at Cecilia. Just a look. The kind that communicates clearly without words. Benedict's voice entered the room like a cold current. "Be careful, Vaughan. That cup has shown better manners than you." Dorian turned to look at him. Benedict was looking back with an expression that was entirely composed and absolutely implacable, and Dorian was a man smart enough to read the difference between a duke who was disengaged and a duke who had decided to pay attention. He left within the hour. Later, in the garden, the one path that had been cleared of snow for walking, between the yew hedges, Cecilia turned on Benedict with the directness of someone who has used up the day's supply of composure. "You cannot claim me only when another man threatens to," she said. Benedict stopped walking. She had her arms folded against the cold, and she was looking at him with a clarity that was slightly uncomfortable. "You have made very clear that I am here temporarily, and that there is no attachment between us. You cannot then, whenever Lord Vaughan or Lady Carrington or the world at large decides I am vulnerable, step forward and imply otherwise. It is confusing, Your Grace, and it is not kind." He did not defend himself. He was looking at the frozen garden with the expression he wore when something had hit its mark accurately. "You are right," he said. The admission surprised her. She had braced for argument. "I am aware of the inconsistency. I am less certain what to do about it." "Neither am I," she said quietly. They stood in the cold garden together, and the silence between them was not comfortable, but it was honest, which was perhaps better. In the library that night, he told her. Not with speeches. That was not his way. He was standing by the fire, and she was sitting in the reading chair with a shawl around her shoulders, and Pip was asleep on the hearth rug between them, and he said, without preamble, "You terrify me." Cecilia looked up. "Because you make me want things I buried 7 years ago," he said. "I had learned not to want anything in particular. It was a simple arrangement. And then you arrived and fell at my feet and reminded me that I was still alive, and I find that I resent this considerably." She was quiet. "I am telling you this," he said, "not because I intend to act upon it. I am telling you because you asked me to be honest." Cecilia set down her book. She looked at him across the firelit room. This man who had spent 7 years turning grief into discipline and discipline into a form of punishment, who had just said the truest thing she had heard from him, and was standing very still waiting to see what she did with it. "I will not be loved out of pity," she said. "I will not be the remedy for your grief. If you want me, I need to be wanted for myself, not for what you imagine I have done for this house." He said, "Pity never made a man forget how to breathe." The fire crackled. She stood up. She walked toward the door. He did not stop her. She turned in the doorway, and they looked at each other across the room, and then she said, "Find out what you want, Benedict. When you know, tell me." She went to her room. He stood in the library for a long time, alone with the fire and Pip, who had woken up and was now regarding him with the profound and slightly accusatory attention of a dog who knows everything and approves of nothing. 3 days after this, a message arrived that Vivienne and Dorian had been seen at the same Derbyshire dinner party. Sebastian found out through his own intelligence channels. A friend of a friend. A remark overheard. And he told Benedict with the directness of a man delivering bad news that cannot be softened. "They are comparing notes," Sebastian said. "Whatever Dorian told her about Cecilia's history, Vivienne intends to use it." "When?" Benedict asked. "The winter relief ball." Benedict was silent. "They intend," Sebastian said carefully, "to ensure that when Cecilia is most visible, in the full presence of the county's society, The account of her past is presented in the worst possible light. They will make her look like a schemer. They will make her look like she arranged her own arrival. Here, they will make her an embarrassment you cannot afford." Benedict said nothing for a long time. "Will you let them?" Sebastian asked. Benedict turned and looked at his brother. No, Ashbourne Hall had not opened its ballroom in 7 years. The servants who remembered it remembered the ballroom as Evangeline's room, not because she had owned it, but because she had made it feel alive. She had chosen the arrangement of the chandeliers, the pattern of the flooring polish, the flowers that always stood at the entrance. She had danced there, she had played hostess there, she had laughed there, and the room had laughed back. Opening it now was a complicated act. It took 3 days to clean. Dust sheets came down from the chandeliers to reveal crystal that still caught the light perfectly. The floor was polished until it reflected the candles like still water. The musicians' gallery was unlocked and aired. The florist was summoned from the village, and the flowers that arrived were white. Cecilia had suggested white, carefully, to Mrs. Warren, who had paused, and then nodded and said nothing. Cecilia helped where she could. She helped fold calling cards, and organize the seating arrangements, and assist Mrs. Warren with the logistics of supper provisions, and she knocked one vase from a table, and stepped backward into a floral arrangement in the corridor, and nearly sent the seating plans sideways in a draught. And throughout all of it, Benedict watched her from doorways with an expression that he would have described, if pressed, as supervisory. It was not supervisory. The evening of the ball, she came downstairs in pale blue silk, with silver embroidery at the hem and the cuffs, and her hair pinned with 2 small pearl clips, and she was not beautiful in the fashion plate way that the ballroom would be full of. She was beautiful in the way that something is beautiful when it is entirely itself and has stopped trying to be anything else. Benedict saw her from the landing. He came down the stairs. He stood before her. He had prepared something to say, something appropriate, something that acknowledged the occasion without acknowledging the rest of it. He said, "You look," and then he stopped. She waited. "Like someone pretending she belongs," she said, and her voice was light, but her eyes were not. He looked at her for a long moment. "Like someone this house has been waiting for." The color that came to her face was not embarrassment, or not only embarrassment. She turned away before he could see the rest of it. They went into the ballroom together. The room filled. The county's society arrived in carriages and cold air and silk and judgment, and Ashbourne Hall received them with the gracious formality it did everything. Benedict moved through the room with the controlled ease of a man who had navigated these waters since boyhood. Sebastian worked the room with his characteristic warmth, deflecting questions and smoothing arrivals, with the skill of someone who has had years of practice, protecting his brother from society's appetite. Cecilia stood near the entrance to the supper room and held her champagne glass with both hands and watched everything with clear, steady eyes. She knew what was coming, not the exact shape of it, but she had been in enough rooms like this. Rooms where a woman's history could be weaponized by a smile and a well-placed remark, to feel the current in the air. Vivienne was there, glacial and perfectly dressed. Dorian was there, charming and watchful. They moved through the room separately, which was the tell. They were not working together, visibly, which meant they intended to be very visible separately. It began with Vivienne, because it always began with Vivienne. She brought it up near the supper-room door, in a cluster of 3 matrons and 2 younger ladies, in a tone of perfectly calibrated concern. She spoke of the difficulty of the season, the cold, the particular vulnerability of a woman without family connections who found herself in an unfamiliar household. She did not name Cecilia. She did not need to. Every eye in the group shifted toward the corner where Cecilia was standing. Then Dorian, approaching from the other side of the room, was asked directly, by a man who had been primed to ask about Cecilia's time in his household. He answered with gentle regret. He spoke of instability, of professional difficulty, of a situation that had been complex and saddening. The word used in a second-hand account was dismissed. The whispers ran through the room, like water through cracks. A dismissed companion, without reference, who arrived in a hired carriage, who made the Duke laugh. Someone near the orchestra, she could not see who, said it loud enough to be heard, fell at his feet and into his house. Rather convenient, wasn't it? Laughter, polite, terrible, social laughter. Cecilia set down her champagne glass. She did not look at anyone. She looked at the far end of the ballroom, where the door that led to the side corridor was clearly visible, and she began to move toward it, because she had been in enough rooms to know when a room had made its decision. And this room had made its decision, and the only thing left to do was to leave it with as much dignity as she could carry. She had nearly reached the side door. The room went quiet. Not a natural quiet. The sudden, attended quiet of a ballroom when someone in authority has moved to its center. Cecilia turned. Benedict Sterling was standing in the middle of the Ashbourne ballroom for the first time in 7 years, and he was not standing there politely. He had been watching from the gallery above the main floor when he heard it. The particular quality of that laughter, the kind that turns on a person rather than with them. He had been watching Cecilia's face when the whispers reached her, had seen her set down her glass art with complete control and begin to walk toward the side door, and something in him had moved with a speed and a certainty that bypassed every careful, managed thing he had built around himself in 7 years. He came down the gallery stairs. He crossed the ballroom floor. He stopped in the center of it. The music had paused. The musicians watched him from their gallery. The guests had turned toward him with the instinctive attention that people pay to power when it moves unexpectedly. He looked at Dorian Vaughan. Lord Vaughan, he said, and his voice was the particular voice he used in Parliament, when he intended something to be heard clearly and remembered permanently. Miss Pembroke was in your employment for 14 months. She resigned her position after you made advances she was not obligated to accept and had every right to decline. Your subsequent account of her conduct was designed to prevent her from securing honest employment elsewhere. That account was false, and it was cruel, and you will not repeat it in this county or any other. The room was extraordinarily still. Dorian's charming face had rearranged itself into something considerably less charming. He said nothing. Benedict turned. He looked at Vivienne. She met his eyes with the courage of someone who had not quite expected this, and was deciding how to manage it. "Lady Carrington," he said, "I have always respected your intelligence. I ask you to apply it to the difference between social judgment and deliberate cruelty. You know that difference. I think you have chosen tonight to ignore it." Vivienne's chin went up. She said nothing. Benedict looked at the room, the full room, the assembled society of the county. Every face turned toward him in the attentive silence of people who had not expected this evening to matter, and now understood it did. "Miss Pembroke did not shame this house," he said. "She revived it." He paused. "I have not smiled in 7 years. Those of you who know me understand this is not an exaggeration. 7 years ago, I lost someone who mattered more to me than I knew how to express. And I have spent those years in a discipline of grief so complete that the servants of this house forgot the sound of my laughter. Last month, Cecilia Pembroke arrived at my door through a misunderstanding, slipped on my icy front steps, landed at my feet in a heap of pale blue skirts, and made me laugh for the first time since Evangeline died. The room was not breathing. She did not plan that. She was mortified by it. But that moment, that ridiculous, ordinary, human moment, began something in this house that I have been struggling against ever since. because I believed that choosing life again was somehow a betrayal of the dead. I no longer believe that, and I will not stand in this ballroom that Evangeline loved and watch a woman of courage, kindness, and dignity be reduced to a rumor because nor she makes powerful men uncomfortable when she refuses them. He looked across the room at Cecilia. She was standing near the wall with both hands pressed together, and her face very still and very pale, and her eyes were bright, in a way that might have been tears, or might have been something fiercer. "Miss Pembroke," he said, and he crossed the ballroom toward her, and the crowd parted, and when he reached her, he offered her his hand. "I believe they are about to resume the music. Will you dance with me?" She looked at him. "You are certain," she said. "Not a question, a check." "I have been certain for some time," he said. "I have been the last to admit it." She took his hand. The music resumed. They danced. Not well, because the truth was that Benedict had not danced in 7 years, and it showed slightly, and the truth was that Cecilia was not the most coordinated woman in England, and at one point she stepped on his foot and apologized in a whisper, and he said, also in a whisper, that it was entirely fine, and she said she was going to improve, and he said he was not certain he wanted her to, and she laughed. It was a real laugh. He thought it was possibly the most beautiful sound he had ever heard in this room. And he thought this in full awareness of what that meant, and without flinching from it. Afterward, in the side corridor where the guests did not go, she stopped walking and turned to face him. "Don't do this for honor," she said. "Don't defend me because it was the right thing. I have had enough men do the right thing on my behalf while wanting nothing to do with me. I defended you because I love you," he said. The words were simple. He had never, until this moment, said them aloud, and he had expected them to be harder. They were not, they were only true. Cecilia looked at him. He watched her consider it, not with disbelief, but with the careful attention of a woman who had been given promises before, and learned what they cost when they were broken. He waited. He lifted his hand and touched her face. Gently, precisely, with the awareness of a man who has waited a very long time for a thing to be right, and is not going to rush the moment when it arrives. The pad of his thumb traced the line of her cheek, and she closed her eyes, just briefly, and when she opened them, she was looking at him with an expression that answered the question he had not yet put into words. He kissed her. It was not a dramatic kiss. It was quiet and warm and sure, and his hand curved against her cheek, and her fingers found the lapel of his coat and held on, and the years of restraint and distance and grief behind it made the simplicity of it more powerful than anything grand could have been. When they drew apart, her forehead rested against his for a moment. 7 years is a long time, she said. Yes, he said. I am sorry it took that long. I arrived rather recently, she said, and her voice was warm. I am not complaining. He almost smiled. That may be the first thing I have heard from you that I did not entirely believe. She laughed, and this time so did he. They were moving back toward the ballroom together when Mrs. Warren appeared from the corridor leading to the east wing. She was carrying something small and flat, sealed in wax, and her expression was the expression of a woman who has found something significant and is not certain what she is about to set in motion. Your Grace, she said. During the repair to her ladyship's writing desk, the mahogany one that was moved to storage in the east wing, we found this. It was wedged beneath the bottom drawer. It appears to have been there some time. She held out the letter. It was addressed in a hand Benedict recognized immediately. A hand he had not seen in 7 years. For Benedict, to be opened when the time is right. Beneath the words, in the same hand, a smaller note that had not been sealed. You will know when. Benedict took it. He stood in the corridor with the letter in his hands, and his face had become very still in a way that was different from his usual controlled stillness. This was not discipline. This was a man standing on the edge of something enormous. Cecilia looked at him. She looked at the letter. She looked at him again. She touched his arm briefly and lightly, and then she stepped back. "I will go back to the ballroom," she said. She gave him the corridor. She gave him the letter. She gave him the space to open something that was between him and a woman who had loved him before she did. And she did it without being asked. And it was perhaps the kindest thing that had happened in Ashbourne Hall in 7 years. Benedict stood in the empty corridor, alone with Evangeline's letter. He opened it. He read it twice. He read it standing in the corridor, with the noise of the ball faint behind the closed door. And then he folded it carefully and placed it in the inner pocket of his coat, next to the note Cecilia had left with the blanket 3 weeks earlier, and he stood quietly for a moment while the meaning of it settled through him. Evangeline had written it before, not on the night she died, but some months before, in one of the periods of private clarity that comes to a person who has considered what might lie ahead and decided to prepare for it. She had always been thoughtful in that particular way. She had always understood Benedict better than he understood himself. She wrote that she knew him. She wrote that she knew how deeply he loved, and how completely, and how the depth of it would become the weight of it if she were not there to carry it with him. She wrote that she did not want his love to become a prison. She wrote that the love he had given her was real and permanent, and that real and permanent things did not require punishment to prove themselves. She wrote that if joy ever found its way back to him, not replacing her, never replacing her, but existing alongside the memory of her, the way 2 rooms in a house can both hold warmth, she did not want him to close the door on it. She asked him, very specifically, not to turn loyalty into a tomb. She asked him, very gently, to live. She signed it with her name, and beneath the signature, in smaller letters, "You have always known how to love well, Benedict. Trust that. Trust yourself." He stood in the corridor of his own house, in the coat he had worn to the first balls. Ashbourne Hall had hosted in 7 years, and he let the last chain of it break. It did not break dramatically. It broke quietly, the way ice breaks in spring, not all at once, but in the subtle shift of a thing that has been held against its nature for a long time, and is finally allowed to move. He went upstairs. He found Cecilia in the corridor outside the nursery. She had come upstairs after the ball wound down. Not to find him, she had not known. He would be there. She had simply found herself at the end of the 3rd-floor corridor, the way she had before, drawn by some instinct she had not interrogated. She was sitting on the floor, her back against the wall, her shoes off, her silk stockings and pale blue skirts looking entirely incongruous against the stone floor. She looked up when she heard him. She looked at his face, and she knew, without being told, that the letter had been important. He sat down across from her, in the same position they had occupied weeks ago, before any of this had been said or admitted. The floor was cold, and the corridor was dark, except for the small oil lamp she had carried up with her. "She told me to live," he said. Cecilia said nothing. She let him have the words. "She knew," he said. "She knew I would do this. Hold on, hold still, hold everything exactly where it was, because movement felt like abandonment. She knew before she died that she would need to tell me she had not abandoned me, that the love she gave me was still real, even if she was not here to carry it." He paused. "She was always cleverer than I was." "She sounds remarkable," Cecilia said. "She was." He looked at the nursery door. "She would have been very irritated with me for these 7 years." "I imagine she would," Cecilia agreed, with a gentleness that was also, very slightly, honest. Something moved across his face that was almost a smile. He stood. He reached up to the hook beside the nursery door. He took down the key. He put it in the lock. It turned with the small, clean sound of a thing that has been waiting patiently. The door opened. The nursery was smaller than she had imagined, and more carefully preserved than she had expected. Not because it had been maintained for use. but because nothing had been touched. The dust lay light on everything, softened by 7 years of careful closed-door air. There was a cradle near the window, rocking-horse proportioned and cream-painted, with a small carved bird on one end. There was a shelf with items ranged on it, a rattle, 2 small cloth animals, a christening gift still in its presentation box, unopened. There was a chair beside the window where someone had sat to wait. The curtains were drawn. Benedict stood in the center of the room for a long moment. Then he walked to the window and pulled back the curtains. The night was clear now. The storm had passed. Stars were visible over the Derbyshire fields, hard and bright and very far up, and the moon laid a path of light across the frozen garden below. The light entered the nursery. "Evangeline," he said quietly, and then, after a pause that was its own completeness, "Edmund," the name he had not spoken in 7 years. The name of the son who had lived for 20 minutes on the night of January the 14th, 7 years before. He said it aloud, in the room that had been prepared for him and never held him, and the room received it without collapsing. The walls stayed up, the ceiling held. The chair beside the window remained a chair beside a window. Cecilia stood in the doorway. She did not go in unless invited. She was holding the lamp. Benedict stood in the light from the window for a long time, and then he turned, and he looked at her in the doorway, and she looked back at him, and he said, "Come in." She came in. She crossed the room and stood beside him at the window, and she did not speak, because there was nothing that needed to be said. She took his hand, and he held it. Not with the careful brevity of the other times, but with the quiet steadiness of a man who has decided not to let go. They stood at the window of the nursery together, with the moon over the fields, and the stars over the moors, and the lamp burning warm behind them. And Ashbourne Hall was quiet around them, in a way that was entirely different from before. Before, it had been the quiet of absence. Now it was the quiet of peace. 3 days later, Benedict asked her to marry him in the music room. He did not plan it elaborately. It was not elaborate by nature. He had tried elaborate in his youth, and found that his heart preferred precision. He had the fire lit and the pianoforte uncovered, and 2 candles on the mantelpiece, and that was the entirety of the preparation. Cecilia came in from the library, where she had been helping Sebastian reorganize an archive that had been disordered for approximately 6 years, and she stopped in the doorway when she saw the uncovered pianoforte and the fire and his face, which was doing something that was not composed in his usual way, but composed in a different way, the way of a man who has made a decision and is at peace with it. "Sit down," he said. She sat at the pianoforte. Old habit. He stood beside it, the way he had stood weeks ago, and this time he did not put his hands on the keys. He put them in his pockets, and he looked at her, and he said what he had thought through carefully over 3 days, and 4 sleepless nights, and 1 long ride across the frozen North Fields. "You arrived at Ashbourne Hall as a mistake," he said. "You were brought here by a deception that I had no part in arranging, and that I was furious about for approximately 3 days. You proceeded to become impossible to ignore through a combination of clumsiness, intelligence, courage, and a dog with the worst judgment in Derbyshire. You played music in a room that had been silent for 7 years. You left a blanket and a note for a man who had forgotten how to accept kindness. You sat on the floor outside a locked door and said nothing, which was the most useful thing anyone has done for me in a very long time." She was looking at him. "You did not replace Evangeline," he said. "You never tried to, and I loved you for it before I was willing to admit I loved you for anything. What you did was something else entirely. You taught me that a man who has been buried is still a man. You taught me that warmth is not betrayal. You reminded me that this house was built to hold a life, not a monument, and you have filled it with extraordinary disorder. And I have found that the extraordinary disorder is the point." He paused. "I am asking you to be my wife," he said, "or not because Sebastian arranged it. Not because you have nowhere else to go, though I intend to ensure that you always have somewhere to go. Not because you made me laugh, though I intend to let you keep doing that. Because I love you, and I choose you, and I want to wake up in this house and know you are in it." Cecilia stood up from the pianoforte bench. She stood up too quickly, which caught the edge of the music stand, which tipped to the left, which would have sent 4 sheets of scarlatti across the floor. Except that Benedict, who was watching for exactly this, reached out and caught it with one hand. They both looked at the music stand. They both looked at each other. "Yes," she said. He set down the music stand. He crossed the room. He cupped her face in both his hands, tilting her toward him, and the firelight was warm on them both, and the pianoforte was uncovered behind her, and Ashbourne Hall was alive around them, in every room that she had opened, and every fire that had been lit, and every curtain that had been pulled back. And he kissed her with the particular thoroughness of a man who has been waiting for this since a January afternoon, when she landed at his feet. She kissed him back with the warmth of a woman who has learned to want things again, and has decided this time to hold on. From somewhere below, the kitchen, probably, Pip began to bark with the righteous indignation of an animal who has not been adequately informed of major developments. They broke apart. Benedict looked toward the door and then back at her. He laughed. Sebastian's response to the news was everything he was. He took both their hands, and his eyes were bright, and he said he was sorry for the deception and deeply grateful for the result. And he offered to stand as witness at the wedding if they would have him, and Cecilia said she would forgive him entirely, on the condition he never again arranged anyone's life through forged correspondence. And he said it was a fair condition, and that he maintained the results were excellent. And Benedict gave him the look he had been giving Sebastian since they were children, and it meant "do not press your luck," and Sebastian smiled at it, which was the correct response. Mrs. Warren heard the news from Harlan, who heard it from Edwin, who heard it from the kitchen maid, and she went to her sitting room and cried very quietly and denied it, when asked which was also the correct response. They were married on the 15th of March, in the small church in the village at the foot of the Ashbourne Estate Road, which had married Sterlings for 200 years, and had not been asked to marry one in 7. It was not a large wedding. Benedict had never wanted large, and Cecilia had not had the circumstances for it, and together they found they preferred the particular intimacy of a ceremony witnessed by people who mattered rather than performed for people who were merely present. Sebastian stood beside Benedict. Mrs. Warren sat in the first pew and maintained her composure until the vows, at which point she gave up maintaining it. Harlan stood at the back of the church with the careful stillness of a man who is feeling considerable things and has decided not to show any of them. Edwin stood beside Harlan and felt considerable things considerably less quietly, which Harlan bore with forbearance. Cecilia came down the aisle in pale ivory silk, with her hair dressed simply and 2 cream roses at her collar, and Benedict watched her come toward him and felt the specific, unambiguous thing that is felt when a man looks at the woman walking toward him to become his wife and understands completely that his life is now divided into before and after. They said the words. They meant them. In the months that followed, Ashbourne Hall became something it had not been since the winter of Evangeline's death. Not the same as it had been, something different, something that honored what it had been while becoming what it was now. Evangeline's portrait was moved from the black-veiled place of storage to the upper gallery, where it had always hung before, unveiled and properly framed and flanked by the winter flowers she had preferred. Her memory was not buried. It was kept, held with the careful tenderness that belonging to the past did not require pain to maintain. The nursery remained as it was, clean and bright and unhurried, The curtains open, the room no longer locked. It was not yet a child's room, but it was no longer a monument. It was a room waiting in its own time, which was as it should be. The ballroom opened for a spring concert in April, a charity benefit for the tenant families who had come through the winter hard. The pianoforte was moved from the music room for the occasion, which caused considerable logistical difficulty and a great deal of noise, and in the middle of the moving process, Cecilia knocked over an entire armful of spring flowers, and they went in 4 directions, and the head footman's expression reached its absolute limit of professional composure, and Benedict came through the doorway in the middle of it, and stood very still, and then began to laugh. The servants, to a person, found they had needed to step outside for a moment. On a morning in May, Ashbourne Hall was full of the sounds that halls are built to hold. The windows were open to the first warm morning of the year. The gardens were moving toward green. The corridor on the east side was full of the combined interests of 2 people sharing a house. An estate map that Cecilia had been annotating, a stack of sheet music that had migrated from the music room to the landing. Pip's various possessions distributed across a considerable area of floor with the strategic confidence of a small animal who has decided he lives here now and intends it to be known. Cecilia came through the entrance hall with an armful of music and a cup of tea balanced on top of it, which was not a stable arrangement, and Benedict, coming down the main staircase, saw it from the landing. He watched her navigate the hall, past the flowers, past the hall table, past the door to the morning room, with the focused determination of a woman who has decided that the cup of tea is not going to be sacrificed. She made it most of the way. At the turn of the corridor, her foot caught the edge of the rug. She wobbled, the music sheets went sideways. The tea stayed, somehow, intact. She caught herself with her free hand on the wall, righted herself, looked at the scattered music, looked at the tea, and looked up at Benedict. "You see," she said, "I am improving." He had reached the bottom of the staircase. He came across the hall, gathered the fallen sheets from the floor, took the cup of tea from her hand with the ease of a man who has had months of practice at this specific task, and looked at her with the expression that he had once forgotten how to wear, and had since relearned in considerable detail. "No, Duchess," he said. "I am," she laughed. Pip, from somewhere in the vicinity of the kitchen, barked his full agreement. And Benedict Sterling, Duke of Ashbourne, who had not smiled in 7 years, who had locked away music and light and warmth and laughter behind the careful discipline of grief, laughed freely in the hall of his own house, with his wife beside him and his dog opinionating from the kitchen, and 7 years of winter finally completely, irrevocably over. The house was alive, all of it, every room. It had taken a woman in a pale blue gown and a cracked hat-box, and 12 pounds of opinionated terrier, and one entirely ungraceful arrival at the front door. And it had taken a man willing, finally, to let the door stay open. For 7 years, Ashbourne Hall had been a monument to grief, its rooms preserved, and its fires cold and its music locked away, where it could not remind anyone that the world continued moving, even when the people in it did not. But Cecilia Pembroke had arrived like a beautiful accident, fallen at the Duke's feet in a heap of skirts and dignity, and taught a mourning man the only thing that 7 years of discipline and ledgers and lonely rides across frozen fields had failed to teach him. That love, when it returns, does not come as betrayal, it comes as grace. And a house that remembers grief can still, in the fullness of time and the warmth of the right presence, remember how to laugh. And that is where Cecilia Pembroke finally found the one place she was always meant to be, not by plan, not by perfection, but by one beautiful, clumsy, impossible accident. If this story moved you, if you smiled, if you felt every moment of it, then this channel is exactly where you belong. Hit that like button. subscribe so you never miss a story. Share this with someone who loves romance done right. And drop your thoughts in the comments below. Did you see Benedict's change coming? Or did Cecilia surprise you? Comment, and we would love to hear from you. More stories are coming, and they are worth the wait. We will see you in the next one.